Salvation Army co-founder Catherine Booth said, if we are to better the future, we must disturb the present. This is the Disturbance podcast from Salvation Army Women's Ministries.
Haere mai. We're back. Welcome to the brand new season of Disturbance. Thanks for coming back to see us. This year we're going to keep digging into women's stories, the important issues that we face, and celebrating some of our inspirational women. And I have one of them right here with me today. We're so blessed in the Salvation Army to have so many amazing women, and that's including Carla Lindsey, who's joining us today.
Hi.
Carla is an amazing Bible teacher, and I like to call her a bit of a biblical super sleuth because she's great at finding the hidden treasures in each Bible story. The things that you never heard of before, even if you've read the stories so many times, and is able to give it a new depth of meaning. And so we thought, what better way to start a new season of Disturbance than by celebrating our most sacred time of year, Easter, and getting Carla to find some of those hidden gems for us that will bring the story to life again for us. So Carla, it's great to have you here. Happy Easter.
Yes, same to you. Happy Easter, and thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff. I love talking about the Bible. It's my favourite thing. So so thank you. And especially to be talking about it at Easter is really important. It's kind of the big one, you know, if we're going to do some research and learn about something, well, Easter is the key for Christians. And so I really like to encourage women, people out there, whoever they are, to read their Bibles this Easter because the story is there and it's a life-changing one. So where should you read the story is a good question because the Bible's a very big and strange book. And so we get the Easter story 4 times in the New Testament, which is really good. There's actually only 2 miracles that are told in all 4 Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which is the feeding of the 5,000 and the resurrection of Jesus. So makes us wonder about the feeding of the 5,000. That could be something to talk about another day. The fact that that's in all 4 makes it very significant. But obviously the resurrection is the whole, and not just the resurrection, but the whole story, the whole lead up to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. This is the big one for Christians. So the story is always told at the end of the gospel, at the end of Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. But each story is a little different. It's the same story, but told by different people with different things in mind, different things that they draw out for the purposes of the audience that they're telling the story to. And so a very good place to start is Mark. Mark is probably the gospel that's written first. He tends to be the shortest, the most succinct, no fluff in that. But the interesting thing that I've learned is that John gives us a whole different take. So Matthew, Mark and Luke are what we call the synoptic gospels. That means they see things in the same way. Not always exactly the same, but generally they seem to have got the same source document and they're writing a similar kind of story. John, however, he does his own thing. And that's probably because John is writing much, much later in time. The 3 others are probably much closer to when the events happen. John was just a young man when he's hanging out with Jesus and when he's seeing this all happen. But probably when he's writing his story, he's an old man and he's had then decades to reflect back and to see what's happened to this story and see how the world has changed. And so for him, you don't just get 3 or 4 chapters at the end of John. He starts telling the Easter story about halfway through the book. In fact, even before that, he's 24 chapters long. And in chapter 11, we have the resurrection of Lazarus. And from Lazarus's resurrection to the end of the book, it covers about a week. So it's like when you get to that midpoint, everything slows right down and he's going to focus right in. And he tells us things like a lot more of what Jesus said. So it's like the others kind of tell us what Jesus did, but John really focuses on what he said and what it meant. And there's a whole lot of other reflecting that goes on. So Mark's the one to read if you want the short story. John's the one to read, and I'd encourage people to read it if they've got time. In fact, if you haven't got time, make time over this week as you come up to Easter. Read that whole week-long story and see those events as they work towards the cross.
Absolutely.
So, lots of interesting things in John.
So it's like he was looking back, you know, he had the time to reflect on what actually the meaning of the cross was, because I think one thing we often don't appreciate being 2,000 years later was that the disciples didn't immediately know the significance of Jesus' death and resurrection. They worked it out and they made the connections over time. So it's like John was sitting back, and as he had time to process realizing it's more and more important and deserves more and more space in the story of Jesus, and that, you know, the significance of the death and the resurrection, which of course we celebrate to this day.
Exactly.
So Carla, we're going to look at some hidden gems. And speaking of the Easter story, we often start our sacred space, certainly in our tradition, at the triumphal entry, the beginning of Passion Week.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit about the triumphal entry? It seems like a good place to start.
Yeah. So, well, it's something, a triumphant entry is something that happened quite often through history, actually.
Right.
So I mean, as Christians, we read it in the Bible, and it's not part of the world that we're in, so we think that was a one-off, but actually...
Yeah, like we just call it the triumphal entry.
Yeah, there were lots of triumphal entries.
That was a thing.
That was a thing. So if an emperor had conquered a city, they would come into it riding on the white charger with all the captives behind them and all the plunder and everything, and people would welcome them with great pomp and ceremony, and the priests would be out. There could be some religious sacrifices and things as part of it, but that whole idea was something that people at Jesus' time were quite used to.
So interesting.
So that's a really interesting twist, because then what Jesus is doing is he's making a triumphant entry that is not a triumphant entry, because there's no horse. He's coming in as a king in a sense, but he's riding on a donkey. And so it kind of throws them all off. This is not quite what they're expecting, but they can still tell that it's a reference to a triumphal entry. If I can find it here, there's one fascinating little bit. The Palm Sunday, that is something, those events, they're in all four Gospels, but this is a really good example of how each Gospel writer tells the story a little bit different. But it's in John. What we have is he tells the story of how Jesus comes in and everything. And then there's this little conjunction there, and it's often and it goes on into the and Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as written. And but what we find that in modern translations, that conjunction is completely missed out. So in the King James it says and, but when I've gone back and looked at it, more often the and is translated but.
Okay.
So if we join two things together by and, it's saying this happened and then the next thing happened, right, in sequence. But when we read it that Jesus came in, but he was riding on a donkey, you see, this tells you this is not going quite where we thought it is. This is a contrast here. And so that's what happens. Exactly. There's a twist in the story.
That is actually really fascinating. I never knew that a triumphal entry was a thing. And you just talked about the but. So what was the twist that Jesus was bringing to this whole tradition of a triumphal entry?
Well, the twist was that they were hoping for a king, and they got a king. He just wasn't a king in the way that they were hoping. You know, he didn't come in to bring military victory. He wasn't riding the right horse for a start. He's on a donkey. He came actually as a humble king, as a humble servant, to bring peace to the world. And I mentioned that each of the gospel writers tells this story a little bit differently. Luke's is particularly interesting. Each gospel writer has the crowd saying slightly different words. They pick up on different ones. And in Luke, the crowd shouts, peace in heaven, glory in the highest. Now, we've heard those words from Luke somewhere else before, announcing Jesus' birth. And so Luke is reminding us there, yes, he comes as king, but he comes as peacemaker. Can I tell you one other thing that popped out as I was reading all the four Gospels, trying to understand this triumphal, not triumphal entry? And that was, actually, I might get you to read this actually.
Okay, I'm reading from Matthew 21, 1-3 and 6-7. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. The disciples went and did as Jesus instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on.
How many donkeys are there in the Palm Sunday story?
2.
I never knew that before. And I wonder how many people don't know that.
I never thought about that either.
Yeah. So I had never noticed that. And I'm sure I've heard that story a lot of times now.
Yeah.
But there are, in fact, 2, only in Matthew. Now, I'm yet to discover exactly why I need to know that there's two, but Matthew tells us that there's two, and he several times says they got them and they brought them, so they were both part of it. And it even sounds like Jesus rode them, so I don't know how he did ride them. Did he ride them at the same time with one foot on each? Probably not. Did he take turns and one got tied?
That would be a certain type of triumphal entry.
It would be unique. So I don't know, but that is a reminder to me that I think I know this story, but actually there are bits that I clearly haven't read quite well enough, because I thought there was only one donkey. Yeah, like I say, I don't know the reason why there needed to be two. I have yet to discover that. Someone can tell me if they know what that answer is.
I'm just speculating here and riffing off what you're saying about the triumphal entry, but if this idea of coming in with a group of sort of chariots and horses was what the conquering king did, then this idea of two humble donkeys instead of a fleet of horses is another powerful metaphor. I mean, in many ways, just thinking about the triumphal entry in this way makes me think that it's a beautiful microcosm, a metaphor for Jesus' whole ministry.
Yeah. It's just a humble working animal.
Humble,
that's what Jesus was, that humble servant.
Exactly, in the way he constantly turned down upside down expectations that, this was going to be a powerful king. No, it's going to be a king of peace.
Yeah.
And he was going to, bring pomp and ceremony. No, he was including the marginalized and the and those who had not been included in power before. And in so many ways that is just reinforced in every part of the gospel story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So amazing. So we go from the joyful, triumphant, but slightly strange entry to a very different scene a week later, don't we? So another story that often gets overlooked as we tell the Passion story is the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah.
You've been doing some thinking about that. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, well, so quickly everything changes. And again, I've had things jump out to me that have always been in the story, and I thought I knew the story, but have sparked my attention, got my interest, and one of those is reference to a naked young man running away in the garden.
We do not give that odd. We do not give that enough attention, do we?
I've never heard a sermon preached on that over Easter.
Why not?
Perhaps we should have. So it's in Mark.
Not in our reenactments. Thank goodness.
That's true. So it's in Mark 15. So again, this is something that is in one of the Gospels, not in all of them. So that in itself is interesting. Mark 15:51, it says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus when they seized him, and he fled naked, leaving the garment behind. So the fact it's a linen garment indicates that the man is well off. He's wealthy if he's wearing linen, and we know he's young. And so scholars have speculated then, well, why does Mark have this bit and no one else has this bit? Who is this? And one of the suggestions is that this is actually the writer of the book of Mark, the Mark that later pops up in the New Testament and is following around with Paul. So perhaps this is Mark, and he was following along, and that's where he got his account from that he wrote down, because he was right there, and he's put his own little bit in the story. But when I've dug into that a little bit more, I found something else really interesting, because like I said, it's those differences between those synoptic gospels that could give us some clues. And there's something very interesting in another story in Mark which refers to a rich young man, and that's the story where there's a parable as part of that story where this rich young man has come to Jesus and said, if I kept all the commandments, am I in the kingdom, kind of thing. And Jesus says, well, actually, no, you need to sell everything. And his face drops. This is devastating. This is something he feels is too hard. But only in Mark, and we find the story in Mark 10, only in Mark we read that as this conversation is going on, it says Jesus looked at him and loved him. So no, just that line itself is lovely, isn't it?
So much pathos in that.
And
you feel it.
Try and imagine what those eyes looked at, that it was just love. It was in those eyes.
Absolutely.
But that raises the question, well, who would have known that Jesus looked at him and loved him? Well, certainly the one that he was looking at.
Absolutely.
So who was he looking at? And actually, we read this story and we presume that the guy, it says he goes away sad. But did he stay away? Was that the end of it,
Yeah.
Or did he come back to Jesus?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because he remembered the look of love in those eyes. And could this actually be the Mark who then flees naked?
The rich young man.
Yes.
That flees.
Could it be? I mean, we're speculating. This is highly speculative. We don't know.
But it's fascinating, isn't it?
It's just interesting because, and it reminds me that when we read people's stories in the Bible, we're getting but just a little bit of the story. We don't know what happens after.
Exactly.
And we can presume his ending is sad. He goes away, it was too hard. But maybe that wasn't the end. Maybe he came back, and actually we're reading so much of our Bible today because he actually... He did do what he needed to do to follow Jesus.
There's two things that I'm reflecting on as you talk to me. One is that when we read that story, we so often default to a judgmental attitude. So we're saying, like, unless you're willing to do this, you can't follow me. And we see that as a sacrifice, But the fact that Jesus loved him, so he's speaking out of compassion, changes the sort of tone of the story. But then also, like, the ripple effect of Jesus' ministry, that we, there might just be one name in the gospel, and then, often, like, biblical historians, biblical scholars will say, well, that name then appeared in early church documents, so we don't know what effect that one interaction with Jesus had, and how it rippled out and rippled out and rippled out, and is rippling out to this day.
Exactly.
Like Simon of Cyrene, who carried Jesus' cross, right?
Exactly. And he's another fascinating one, where there's just a little bit. And again, it's only in one of the Gospels, which happens to be Mark. Again, we have a little bit extra written about him, which gives us a clue. So Mark 15, it says a certain man from Cyrene, which is Libya, and there was a big Jewish population there at the time of Christ. So Simon of Cyrene, and then Mark adds the father of Alexander and Rufus. He was passing by, and then they forced him to carry the cross. So everybody else, sorry, the other two synoptics say that sentence, but they don't put in the father of Alexander and Rufus. It's just kind of like this extra bit that he chucks in. So it sounds very much like the people then that Mark is writing to are going to go, oh, Alexander,
the people I know,
dead.
Yes.
So who is Mark writing to?
Yes.
Well, scholars think that probably Mark was writing to Christians in the Roman church. And so if you look then at the book of Romans, and you come to, there's a list of people at the end of Romans chapter 16, and Paul sends his greetings to someone called Rufus. So is there a connection?
How incredible.
So we just don't know, but it could well be that Simon, he has this life-changing moment one day, meets Jesus there, and then it didn't just stop there for him, that he's told his family, and they've become key people in the church in Rome, and it snowballed from there. And it reminds us too, though, that we just never know where things are going to go, and we might not get to see it. Yes. But what potentially is the ripple effect of what we do, just those little things.
That's right.
We never know.
It just seems like a rammed-in little detail in the story, but in fact, when they were writing the stories, like you said, they may well have known those people, and that this random little incident was just the beginning of a life-changing story. That's just amazing to me.
Yeah.
Wow. In the same way, I've been thinking about the link between the Marys. All the Marys, we get so many Marys. It seems so random, right? And I've actually been doing a lot of research on a couple of the Marys, and it made me think, why are there so many Marys? I think there's at least 6 in the Gospels, and I discovered that it's a derivative of the word Miriam, and so it was a very common name in the in Judaism, and of course Miriam was the sister of Moses. She was involved in taking the slaves out of Egypt and the establishment of the covenant with God. And in fact, I mean, I sort of didn't really know this because Moses gets all the glory, but it does say in the Bible, for I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And actually in the Talmud, which is very important Jewish teachings, Miriam's considered one of the top 7 female prophets. So Miriam was very significant in the establishment of the covenant between God and his people. And now we've got these Marys, very significant in the Gospels, and the establishment of the new covenant with Jesus, through Jesus. And that just blew my mind, like the importance of the name Mary.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? And there is quite a few.
Yeah.
So have you got a favourite amongst the Marys?
I don't know if I've got a favourite, but there's one I've been doing a lot of thinking about
Yeah,
lately,
yeah.
and that's
Me
Mary of
too.
Bethany.
Oh yeah, me too.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Like her too. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reason why I love her is because, well, she's a very inspirational person. And in fact, I think she's someone that Jesus constantly defended. I read somewhere that, no one was defended more often than Mary of Bethany.
Okay.
And one of the first times she appears to us is in the story of Mary and Martha. And I love this story because it's not what we think it is. I don't know about you, but growing up, have so many times heard, "Are you a Mary or a Martha?" I.e., are you a doer or a beer? But actually, what was happening there was that in Jewish tradition, and in fact in many cultures today, there are very delineated zones in a house that are men's and women's spaces. And, the women's space was the kitchen, the men were in the lounge talking, and Mary kind of like crash banged into someone else's space in a way that not only would be like considered strange and inappropriate. I think N.T. Wright, the scholar, talks about sort of it being like we all have unspoken rules in our culture, and it'll be like someone coming over for dinner and inviting themselves to stay the night and setting up a bed next to yours in the master bedroom. It'll just be like strange. It's not a spoken rule in our culture, but we all know that that's not an appropriate thing to do. So here Mary just crashes into the male sphere, and Martha quite actually understandably is like, "What the heck are you doing?" And Jesus very significantly says she's chosen the better thing to do, and I won't take it from her. In other words, he was giving her a place at his feet as a trainee teacher, and affirming her right to be a disciple or a teacher.
That's cool.
And so I love that story because it is yet again about Jesus challenging the boundaries of the marginalized. And then we see her over and over again at the resurrection of Lazarus, which again was a signposting to Jesus' resurrection. And we very significantly see her at the very beginning of Passover, where she enters again the male sphere, where some bunch of Pharisees and disciples were sitting around, and she does something extremely feminine. She falls to his feet. She opens an extravagant gift and anoints his feet. She dries his feet with her tears. What I love about that is not only, again, did Jesus immediately recognize it as a prophetic act, saying that she's preparing me for her burial, my burial rather. He recognized her as a priest, because in other, like you said, every gospel is slightly different. In another one, she anoints his head with oil, which was the priest would do that as a sign of this person being anointed as king. But she does it in a way that is traditionally considered very feminine and has sometimes been used to diminish women. It's emotional, it's vulnerable, it's raw, it's extravagant. It might even be considered a bit OTT, even considered a bit embarrassing. And the men do kind of grumble and, well, this isn't appropriate. The money could be spent better.
Yes.
But Jesus sees right through that actually thinly veiled pride and says, no, she will. People will always tell her story, and she'll always be honored for that. And again, Jesus is defying those expectations and those boundaries of power, and again is welcoming women into the kingdom of God as equals.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty obsessed with that story. In fact,
I see you like that.
I actually wrote about it in just a quick plug in Raise Your Voice, the God's Design for Gender Equity. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please do.
Yeah. I love that story too. I have so many questions about it though. Like, why did she have that much perfume? I think it was about a year's worth of wages there.
Yeah.
Like, was it just lying around the house? Like, had she saved up? Did she inherit it? And Jesus interprets that as being prepared for his burial. But I wonder in her mind why she thought
what she was doing.
it. Do you know? Do you have any thoughts on why she thought was she just being generous, or was it just like, it's just a generous gift?
I feel like it was an incredibly sacrificial gift. Someone was willing to give an enormous amount to Jesus. So it shows an enormous amount of gratitude.
Yeah.
But also something that's sort of been unfairly attributed to this story is that the woman was in sexual sin.
Yeah.
And actually, and that the sort of like letting down of hair was sort of like loose morals. But actually, that is not correct. That is not in the text. The letting down of hair, in the way that it was actually seen as a sign of grief.
Okay.
So what the early church would have been asking is, what is she grieving? Why is she grieving? And why is she grateful? Those are the pertinent questions.
Okay. That's interesting, because I had heard that you're letting down the hair, that was inappropriate in a sexual kind of way, but grief isn't.
It was, and not all women had to have their head covered. If you were an unmarried woman, for example, you didn't. So there's a lot of, in fact, Pope Gregory in the 5th century has got a lot to answer for,
yes.
because he was the one that secularized her and managed to conflate Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany and called them both prostitutes. So it's just an example of how women have been diminished when actually Jesus lifted them up and championed them constantly.
Something that I really like about that story also is the idea of smell in that story. You know, they reckon that our memories and everything are really it's very connected with smell. When we think of nostalgic things, it's often the smell that will trigger us. And at the beginning of that, we have Jesus arriving at Lazarus's tomb and going, "Don't go in there, he's been dead for days. He stinketh," in the King James.
He
stinketh. But then by the time Mary's come and anointed Jesus' feet, there's this lovely verse that says that basically the smell filled up the whole house. And so which also makes me think, well, did she drop some on the floor? And maybe like even as Jesus is dying on the cross, there's something of that smell that's filling it. And if she's dropped it on his bed and here, he's probably carried that smell and that gift with him. And maybe she has too, because this is really pure perfume. So the smell would have stuck around. So the idea that that gift couldn't be contained as she gave it, it kind of just spread out and filled up whatever space.
But you, do you have a favourite sort of character, or maybe under-championed character in the Gospels?
I like Thomas. He's called Doubting Thomas.
Yes.
But I think we need to change his name to Honest Thomas.
Yes.
Because I think that's what he is. I think it's a bit unfair actually getting that label.
Definitely.
Doubting, like it's a negative thing.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it's so bad to have your doubts. Actually, I think we're allowed to have our doubts and we're allowed to have our questions.
Absolutely.
And the main story that we know about Thomas is the fact that Jesus appears to the disciples. Thomas is not there. Thomas says, well, hey, unless I see this for myself, I'm not going to believe this. And so we go, doubting Thomas, well, bad on you, that's terrible. But actually, there's a couple of really important things about Thomas that happen before we even get to this point that tell us something about what he was like. And it goes back actually to the whole Lazarus story, where we start that week in John. And after Jesus has resurrected Lazarus, people are starting to get a little bit antsy about Jesus at this point, and they know that he's going back for Passover, because that's where all the good Jewish people went. And the disciples are sensing, right, if we go, they're going to know where we are. This is going to be the end. And Jesus has decided that he's going to go, and it is Thomas that says, let's go with him, that we can die with him.
Wow.
And so for whatever else he was a loyal follower. With Jesus, he was going to stick in there to the end. So that's the first thing. Yeah, he's all in, even if it fits to his death. So that's the first thing of note that he says. But the next one is really interesting too. So like I said, in John, Jesus draws out, the writer draws out Jesus' words. We have this whole farewell discourse that takes us from chapter 13 to 17, where Jesus, knowing that he's leaving and he's going to leave these dear friends of his with this great mess, and it's going to seem like everything is just, completely turned to custard. He sits down and he tells them so many things to try and encourage them and get them ready for what's happening. And at the beginning of John 14, Jesus starts saying beautiful, well-known verses about how I'm going ahead of you and I'm going to prepare a place and you're going to come with me, and it's all going to be great. And the disciples are listening to this, but it's Thomas who goes, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how are we going to get there? And I'm like, yay, Thomas.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure there were other times when Jesus was saying something, when the disciples were going, I don't know what he's talking about. Do you know what he's talking about? And I wish that they would have asked a question, because then we'd have some better answers and we might have a clue.
He's a questioner, Thomas. He's a questioner.
Thomas asks an honest question that probably was what was on everyone else's mind, but he was the one who said, well, no, we don't get it, Lord. Tell us the more. Yeah. And it's on the back of that we have the beautiful verses where Jesus says, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life." And it goes on from that because he started asking a question. So we see in Thomas, someone who is loyal and someone who is quite honest, who doesn't mind asking a question. And we see in him then someone who's not going to be gullible. And you see, I don't blame him for not being 100% sure that Jesus has resurrected. You know, okay, the other guy said he was, but Thomas he's been with Jesus for these 3 years. He's put everything into Jesus. He knows how he thought this was going to go. This is not what he thought was going to happen. It's gone so bad. And I can understand him for being a bit hesitant about that and asking some questions. And I think it's wise to ask some questions. We don't want to be gullible. In fact, I think a little bit of doubt is quite okay. But doubt is not always the enemy of faith.
No.
In fact, in a quote that I love, it says, "Doubts are the ants in the pants of faith. They keep it awake and moving."
Yes.
And so, you see, if we don't have questions, if we don't have doubts, we can just coast along. And I've heard the Easter story so many times. I know Jesus, and we never grow and we never get better and we never move forward in our faith. But if we're someone who's prepared to ask questions, then things change. And in fact, we need people in the world to ask questions. I mean, if people hadn't questioned that the earth was flat, or did the earth go around the sun, or vice versa, like how nothing would have changed, but people pushed against and asked questions. And even in the church, if William Booth had simply accepted the way that church was done, well, we wouldn't even be here.
Absolutely.
So both in the world and in the church and in our individual faith, it's okay to be someone who asks questions. And Jesus didn't give Thomas a hard time for asking the question. When he finally appears, he says, it's okay. You can have a look. Even in that period when he had his doubts, and he probably didn't call himself a believer anymore, he still stayed connected to the believers. He hadn't given up all hope. He was still open to the fact that Jesus perhaps had become resurrected, because in that time between when Jesus appeared to the disciples and then when he appeared to Thomas, the whole week had gone past. And that must have seemed like a long time, because Jesus is dead as far as Thomas knows. The authorities are after them. Are they all going to be crucified too? I wouldn't blame Thomas if he said, "I'm back to my old occupation. Thank you. See you. Nice knowing you. It's been a good 3 years, but I'm out of here." But even though he wasn't a believer in the same way, he stayed there. He kept connected. And therefore, when Jesus did turn up, he was there to see it. If he'd gone home, he wouldn't have known. And so that would be a word of encouragement I want to give to people who might be listening today, who might say, I've got doubts, I've got questions, I'm not even sure if I'm a believer or quite what I am. I would say keep connected and keep open, because if you keep putting yourself in places where God might turn up, then you might be there and you might get those answers. Whereas if you remove yourself completely, might make it a bit harder. So there's room for doubters in church. That's what I'm saying. There's room for questioners. You're welcome. Come to church this Easter.
Yeah. And even actually, like, as you've been telling the story, I've related to so many parts of it, because I think if you have walked with God for a certain amount of time, and I don't know, for myself, I've been very, have loved God since I was quite young and been passionate about God. And then there always comes a time in everyone's life, I think, where you say, why God? Something happens in life that makes God feel very far away. And you go through your time of, why God? How did you let this happen, God? And that actually that's okay. That is okay. And that I still love, and I love that idea that you said about just being there when Jesus turns up, with questions, even with our questions. Well, I've got like one final question for you, Carla, and that's just simply, what does Easter mean to you?
Easter is the idea of redemption. It's the idea that no matter how bleak things look, God can turn it around. I have a favourite verse. It's near the end of Genesis where Joseph is saying to his brothers, you meant this for bad, but God can turn it around, and he made it. He used it for his purposes. He brought good out of the horrible things that had happened in Joseph's life. It's the story all the way through the Bible.
Absolutely.
It's, potentially it's the story of Mark that we've read, looked at now. It's the story of that triumphal entry that they thought was one way but turned around and went somewhere else. So many people.
It's the story of Simon,
Cyrene,
and Rufus.
Exactly, all of those people. It's the story, and it's a story that we need today. Just thinking about our family since the beginning of the year, we've had a massive accident and 3 people in hospital, and all pretty serious. But the story of Easter is that there's nothing that's beyond redemption. Everything can turn around. So that's both in situations, but it's in people's lives and in relationships and everything. That's the story of the cross. If even the death can turn into life, if God can do that, then what can he do for us? One of my favourite verses from the Message in Colossians, it says, all the broken and dislocated pieces of the universe, the people and things, the animals and atoms, all properly fit together in vibrant harmony because of his death. So that everything can come together because of Easter. All comes to Jesus.
Yeah, that's one of my favourite passages, and I think similarly it says Jesus is the fulfilment of everything in every way.
Yeah,
and it's just
that's the NIV.
And that brings me to something I was thinking about, and that when Jesus first appeared to the disciples, the first thing he said was, peace be with you. Of all the things he could have said, he said, peace be with you. And that's, of course, the Jewish shalom, which means much more than peace. It means everything restored to as it should be.
Yeah.
And I, again, learned from David Noakes in the Raise Your Voice that it was Eden is sort of another way of thinking of the kingdom of God. Everything as it should be, and this is the work of God, is to bring restoration and bring everything as it should be. So the Easter is that full restoration of everything, every atom, the fullness of everything. Yeah, it's incredible, really. This has just been the most fun and enlightening conversation. I've absolutely loved it. And it makes me think that we've even just been scratching the surface. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us, Carla. And of course, we've been talking about the hidden gems, of the Easter story. But these are all signposts towards Jesus, and all bring us back to the beauty of the death and the resurrection. So it's been such a privilege to celebrate Easter with you, Carla, and to everyone listening, and to you as well. Shalom, peace be with you this Easter.
Thank you.